Learning to talk about our planet in English is not just about vocabulary. It's about becoming part of one of the most important conversations of our time. Imagine you are at an international conference, a university seminar, or even just a dinner party in an English-speaking country, someone says. The carbon footprint of fast fashion is appalling. We need stricter ESG regulations and a real commitment to net zero. Do you know what they mean? Can you respond confidently? Can you agree, disagree, or ask a thoughtful follow-up question? Environmental topics are everywhere in the news, in the workplace, in school, and in everyday conversations. Whether you are an engineer, a business professional, a student, or simply someone who cares about the world, knowing this vocabulary will help you speak, write, and think more clearly about the planet we share. This episode takes you through the most important environmental vocabulary in English, grouped by theme, with real-life examples, explanations, and practice conversations. By the end, you'll be ready to join the global environmental conversation with confidence.
Yeah, and that mission is just, well, it's incredibly urgent right now. Because the words we choose, they actually determine the solutions we can even imagine.
Right, totally.
Like when we look at complex systems, say a failing car engine, we rely on really clear diagnostics. You plug a computer into the car, you read an error code, and boom, you know which valve is broken.
It's a super clean, just a binary process.
Exactly. But the vocabulary of planetary health is not nearly that straightforward. It's muddy.
It really is. I mean, when you step into the realm of global ecosystems or, environmental policy, you're looking at a diagnostic landscape that is just incredibly murky.
Oh, for sure.
It's kind of like the planetary diagnostic computer is flashing 1,000 different warnings all at once, and it's in a dialect most people have never actually studied.
Right. And if we don't have the nuanced language to decode those warnings, we just can't fix the engine.
Which is why we're doing this deep dive today. We're building this toolkit from the ground up for you.
Yeah, we really want to move beyond just like memorizing flashcards.
Yeah.
We need to explore the mechanisms behind these words, the science, the history, the geopolitical friction.
Because it's one thing to know what an acronym stands for, right? It's entirely another to understand how it's used as a weapon in a high-stakes boardroom negotiation.
Absolutely.
So let's unpack this. We have to start with the baseline, the absolute foundation of the science. And I really want to kick things off with a fundamental confusion that just derails so many public conversations before they even start.
I think I know where you're going with this, mixing up weather and climate.
Yes. We see this every single winter. A blizzard rolls through a major city in late April, and someone inevitably posts online, well, so much for global warming.
It happens every year. And, that confusion really stems from a lack of understanding about temporal scale.
The timeline of it.
Right. Let's break down the mechanics. Weather refers to the highly chaotic, very short-term atmospheric conditions in a specific local area.
So like the air pressure, humidity, temperature dropping suddenly.
Exactly. Weather is what dictates whether you need an umbrella today or, say, a heavy coat tomorrow.
Okay, so if I say it's pouring rain in London this afternoon, that is the weather. It's a temporary, isolated state. It changes by the hour.
You've got it. Climate, however, is a statistical construct. It's the long-term pattern of those conditions over a really broad region.
How long are we talking?
Scientifically, meteorologists use a standard reference period of 30 years to establish a climate baseline.
Wow, 30 years.
Yeah, 30 years is generally considered the minimum amount of time you need to filter out the noise of short-term anomalies.
Like that random April blizzard.
Right, or an El Nino event.
Yeah.
You filter those out to reveal the actual macro trend. So while the weather in London might occasionally be freezing, the climate of London is definitively temperate and mild.
That makes total sense. So when scientists discuss climate change, they aren't looking at last weekend's weather. They are pointing to a structural shift in those 30-year statistical baselines across the whole globe.
Yes, they are completely independent concepts in that way.
So here's where it gets really interesting for me. When we talk about the physical mechanics of why those long-term baselines are shifting upward, we have to talk about the greenhouse effect.
Right.
And in popular culture, this term has taken on a deeply sinister vibe. People basically use it as a synonym for pollution.
Which is a profound misunderstanding of atmospheric physics, honestly.
Yeah.
The greenhouse effect is, quite literally, the only reason biological life can exist on this planet.
Right? Really? The only reason?
Yeah. Without it, we'd be dead.
Yeah.
To understand how it works, you have to look at solar radiation. The sun emits energy primarily as shortwave radiation.
Okay, and that comes down to us.
Exactly. It passes right through our atmosphere and warms the Earth's surface.
But the Earth absorbs that heat, and it can't just hold on to it forever, right? Otherwise, we would instantly combust.
Right. So the Earth reflects that energy back out towards space. But because the Earth is much cooler than the sun, it emits that energy as long-wave infrared radiation.
Okay, I'm tracking with you.
Now, certain trace gases in our atmosphere, what we call greenhouse gases, they have a molecular structure that allows that incoming shortwave radiation to pass through. But they physically block and absorb that outgoing long-wave infrared radiation.
So they basically trap the heat from escaping.
They trap the heat, and if we completely strip those gases away, the global average temperature would drop by roughly 33 degrees Celsius.
Wow, 33 degrees colder. The oceans would freeze solid. We'd just be a lifeless giant snowball spinning through the void.
Literally. So the natural greenhouse effect is a miracle of physics. The crisis we are facing is not the existence of it.
It's the extreme acceleration of it.
Yes, what we term global warming, which is aggressively driven by human activity.
Right.
We're rapidly altering the chemical composition of the atmosphere.
By pumping massive volumes of these specific greenhouse gases, the GHGs, into the sky. Let's define the heavy hitters in that GHG category. You have carbon dioxide, or CO2, which gets the most press.
Right, the big one.
But there's also methane, CH4, and nitrous oxide, N2O.
And, each of those gases operates a bit differently. CO2 is the most abundant, and it stays up there in the atmosphere for centuries.
Centuries? That's a long time to trap heat.
It really is.
Yeah.
But methane is much shorter lived. It degrades after about a decade or two. However, its warming potential is roughly 80 times more potent than CO2 over a 20-year period.
80 times. So it's incredibly efficient at trapping heat.
Yeah, it's like a flash fire.
I always try to visualize this with an analogy for people. The natural greenhouse effect is like having a perfectly balanced, cozy blanket on your bed on a winter night.
I like that.
Right. That one blanket keeps your body heat in and keeps you comfortably alive. But anthropogenic global warming, the human-driven part, is like someone sneaking into your room while you sleep and throwing 5 incredibly thick, heavy-down blankets on top of you.
Oh, that's a visceral image.
Suddenly, the system that was keeping you alive is suffocating you. You have a dangerous fever, your heart rate is spiking, and you are entirely trapped under the weight of it.
That is a highly accurate way to frame it. And honestly, that feverish panic is mirrored perfectly in how the English language has evolved to match the terrifying reality of the data.
The vocabulary has totally escalated, hasn't it?
Oh, massively. If you look at the historical timeline, the terminology has continuously shifted. In the 1970s, scientists very cautiously referred to inadvertent climate modification.
Inadvertent climate modification? That sounds so mild.
Doesn't it? By the late 80s and 90s, the consensus settled on climate change and global warming.
But over the last few years, we've seen a huge linguistic pivot. The conversation shifted to the climate crisis, and then very quickly to climate emergency.
Right. And that wasn't just a media buzzword. Hundreds of municipal and national governments around the world actually passed formal legislation declaring a climate emergency.
Which legally compels them to prioritize environmental action.
Exactly. And now, at the bleeding edge of the scientific and journalistic community, you increasingly hear the phrase climate breakdown.
That specific phrase, climate breakdown, is staggering. I mean, change sounds so neutral, almost passive. Seasons change, clothes change.
Yeah, change isn't scary.
Right. And warming can almost sound pleasant if you live in a cold country. But breakdown removes all ambiguity. It implies a total catastrophic collapse of stable systems.
The systems that have allowed human civilization and agriculture to function for the last 10,000 years. To understand the mechanics of that breakdown, we have to isolate the primary drivers.
Okay, let's do it.
Historically and currently, the dominant driver is our reliance on fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas.
Which fundamentally are really just ancient sunlight.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, they're the compressed, fossilized remains of organic matter plants and microorganisms that lived millions of years ago. They absorbed carbon from the air, died, and were buried.
So when we dig them up and ignite them, we are taking hundreds of millions of years of sequestered carbon and venting it all back into the atmosphere in the span of a single century.
It's a massive geochemical shock to the system.
It is. And compounding that shock is deforestation. Think about the Amazon rainforest. It isn't just a collection of trees.
It's a vital organ of the planet.
Exactly. It actively pulls CO2 out of the air. When vast swaths of it are logged or burned for agriculture, we suffer a double blow. We lose the planet's capacity to absorb carbon moving forward, and we immediately release all the carbon those trees have been storing.
And it is crucial to recognize that the historical baseline for this was really set by industrialization in the 19th and 20th centuries. The modern crisis is kind of just the compounding interest of that original debt.
That's a very fair assessment.
When you look at current emissions data, the sheer scale of the output is staggering. Just the transport sector alone, every car, cargo ship, and commercial flight accounts for roughly 16% of the total global greenhouse gas output.
Which brings us to the fallout. We are no longer talking about predictive models for the year 2100. We're observing the collapse of baselines in real time.
What are the main things we're tracking right now?
Well, sea level rise is a huge one. It's caused not only by the melting of land-based ice sheets in places like Greenland and Antarctica, but also by thermal expansion.
Thermal expansion.
Yeah, because as ocean water warms, the physical molecules spread out and take up more volume.
Oh, wow. So the water literally expands. That poses an immediate existential threat to low-lying geographies from Bangladesh to Miami to the Maldives.
Absolutely. And we're also witnessing the profound amplification of extreme weather events. The thermodynamic reality is that warmer air holds more moisture.
It's about 7% more for every degree Celsius of warming.
Spot on. So when it rains, it catastrophically pours. The 2022 floods in Pakistan are a harrowing example of this.
That was devastating. Anomalous monsoon dynamics, supercharged by a warming Arabian Sea, it resulted in 1/3 of the entire country being submerged.
1/3 of the country. 33 million people were impacted. Entire regional agricultural systems were simply washed away.
And alongside the visible destruction of infrastructure, we are tracking invisible chemical disasters too, primarily ocean acidification.
Right. The oceans are the planet's largest carbon sink. They absorb about a quarter of all the CO2 we emit.
But when CO2 dissolves in seawater, it triggers a chemical reaction that forms carbonic acid, and that steadily lowers the ocean's pH.
And that slight change in pH is just devastating for any marine organism that builds a shell or a skeleton out of calcium carbonate.
Like oysters and clams, and most importantly, coral reefs. The more acidic the water becomes, the harder it is for them to calcify.
Eventually, the water literally begins to dissolve their existing structures.
And considering that coral reefs support 25% of all known marine species, we are talking about the foundational collapse of the ocean's food web.
It's terrifying. And then there is the deeply concerning phenomenon of permafrost thaw. Across the Arctic, vast stretches of ground have been permanently frozen for millennia.
Locked inside that frozen soil are unimaginable quantities of organic matter, right?
Yes. And as the Arctic warms, and it's warming nearly 4 times faster than the rest of the globe, that permafrost thaws. Microbes wake up, begin consuming that organic matter, and release massive plumes of methane directly into the atmosphere.
So we are pulling those 5 heavy blankets tighter and tighter around ourselves, and the planet is beginning to sweat.
Very much so.
And all these atmospheric changes, all these complex chemical reactions, ultimately trace back to one primary culprit. There is a single elemental building block that has completely hijacked the global conversation. Let's explore the currency of the crisis.
The carbon economy.
Exactly. We need to achieve fluency in carbon.
In the context of the 21st century, carbon is no longer just the 6th element on the periodic table. It has evolved into the ultimate global currency of environmental accountability.
And geopolitical power, honestly.
Absolutely. To frame the severity of this, scientists analyze ice cores for Antarctica. They drill miles deep to extract ancient ice that contains microscopic, trapped bubbles of the Earth's past atmosphere.
Like tiny atmospheric time capsules.
Yes. And those bubbles prove that atmospheric CO2 levels right now are significantly higher than at any point in the last 800,000 years.
800,000 years. That predates the evolutionary emergence of modern Homo sapiens.
We are navigating an atmosphere our species has literally never breathed before.
That gives me chills. And because carbon is the central metric of this crisis, an entire dictionary of compound words has formed around it. Let's decode them, starting with the most ubiquitous, the carbon footprint.
A carbon footprint quantifies the total greenhouse gas emissions caused directly and indirectly by an individual, an organization, an event, or a product.
Right. For instance, calculating the carbon footprint of a single passenger flying from London to New York yields a staggering figure of roughly 1.6 tons of CO2.
What's fascinating about the term carbon footprint, though, is its history. It wasn't primarily popularized by environmental scientists.
No, where did it come from?
It was actually pushed into the mainstream by a massive advertising campaign from the fossil fuel giant British Petroleum in the early 2000s.
Right, really, BP.
Yeah. It was a brilliant, highly controversial PR strategy to shift the linguistic focus and the moral blame away from the systemic industrial production of fossil fuels and place it directly onto the personal consumption habits of everyday citizens.
Oh, wow. That is incredibly sneaky. So they basically made it our problem instead of theirs.
That historical context is vital because it reveals how language can be weaponized. But regardless of its origin, calculating a footprint is the necessary first step toward decarbonization.
And decarbonization is arguably the most complex industrial and economic challenge in human history. It demands the absolute elimination of carbon dioxide emissions from every sector of the global economy.
And that goes way beyond just putting solar panels on a roof. When you look at heavy industries, the mechanisms are incredibly stubborn.
Like the global steel industry, for example.
Right. They don't just burn coal for the intense heat required to melt iron ore. They use processed coal, called coke, as a chemical reducing agent to strip the oxygen away from the iron.
So the CO2 is a fundamental, unavoidable byproduct of the chemical reaction itself. It's not just an energy issue.
Exactly. Decarbonizing steel requires entirely new, massively expensive, and currently unscaled technologies like green hydrogen reduction.
Which is why corporate climate pledges require intense linguistic scrutiny. You will constantly see companies throwing around the terms carbon neutral and net zero as if they are perfectly interchangeable synonyms.
Oh, and they're definitely not. The difference between them is a massive gulf in corporate responsibility.
Let's draw a hard line between them. If a massive logistics company claims to be carbon neutral, what are they actually doing?
Well, carbon neutral fundamentally relies on an accounting trick. It means that the company is balancing the emissions they produce with an equivalent amount of emissions they supposedly remove from the atmosphere.
Crucially, a company can theoretically maintain or even increase their massive levels of pollution, right? As long as they throw enough money at cheap carbon offsets to balance the spreadsheet.
Precisely. They just pay a third party to protect a forest in another country, and they get to call themselves neutral.
So it's a mathematical illusion that allows business as usual to continue. Net zero, on the other hand, is the gold standard championed by the Paris Agreement.
Yes, and frameworks like the Science-Based Targets Initiative. A rigorous net zero commitment demands that an entity structurally transforms its operations to reduce its actual physical emissions by roughly 90% first.
Wow, 90% reduction first. That's huge.
They must transition to renewable energy, electrify their fleets, redesign their supply chains. Only after they have hit the absolute maximum limit of technological reduction are they allowed to use high-quality removals to offset the tiny, unavoidable residual fraction of emissions.
So net zero requires actual systemic change. Carbon neutrality just requires a budget for offsets.
That's the perfect way to summarize it.
Which brings us directly to the mechanics of those carbon offsets, alongside carbon taxes and carbon capture. Let's look at offsets first.
The theory is that you fund a project, say, planting a massive commercial timber forest, to compensate for the pollution you emitted elsewhere.
But the offset market is just fraught with scientific integrity issues, right?
Oh, completely. You have to prove additionality. Meaning, would that forest have been planted anyway without your funding? If so, your offset is meaningless.
And you have to prove permanence. What happens if a wildfire burns that offset forest to the ground 10 years from now?
Exactly. All that carbon goes back into the air, and your offset literally goes up in smoke.
Okay, then you have carbon pricing or a carbon tax. This is a macroeconomic policy tool. The government dictates that emitting a ton of CO2 will cost a specific dollar amount.
By making it financially painful to pollute, you mathematically force companies to innovate and switch to cleaner alternatives simply to protect their profit margins.
And finally, we have carbon capture, specifically direct air capture, or DAC. This involves building massive industrial facilities with giant fans and chemical filters to actively suck CO2 straight out of the ambient air.
Which sounds like the ultimate silver bullet, doesn't it?
It does, but the thermodynamics are brutal. CO2 is dispersed in the atmosphere at about 420 parts per million. It is the chemical equivalent of trying to find a specific needle in a globe-spanning haystack.
The energy required to run those fans and heat the chemical filters to release the captured carbon is astronomical. It is an unscaled, incredibly expensive technology. Critics fear it's just being used as an excuse to delay cutting emissions today.
Knowing this vocabulary allows you to see through the corporate spin. Imagine you're reviewing a major airline's annual sustainability report. Without this knowledge, their bold claim of achieving carbon neutrality by 2025 sounds fantastic.
Right, you'd think they solved flying.
But with this vocabulary, you immediately know to look for the mechanisms. You look at their methodology and realize they aren't actually reducing their jet fuel consumption. They're just buying millions of dollars of incredibly cheap, low-quality forestry offsets.
It's the modern equivalent of the medieval indulgence system.
Oh, that's such a good comparison. Back then, wealthy aristocrats would just pay the church a fee to wipe away their sins without ever having to change their immoral behavior.
Exactly. Today, a fossil fuel giant throws some money at a tree-planting NGO and claims they are green while continuing to drill for oil.
Yeah.
Understanding the precise difference between neutrality and net zero is your primary defense against that deception.
It proves that vocabulary is armor. But if cutting carbon is the immediate defensive strategy to stop the bleeding, we have to ask, what is the proactive blueprint?
Right. What is the overarching philosophy for how we actually build a society, an economy, and an agricultural system that doesn't inevitably self-destruct?
That brings us to the deep historical roots of sustainability. It's a word that has been slapped onto everything from paper towels to mutual funds, completely diluting its power.
It really has lost its punch.
To actually grasp what it means, we have to travel back to its linguistic origins. The word derives from the Latin root sustinere,
which translates to hold up, to bear, or to support.
I love that origin because it implies intense active effort. A bridge doesn't just effortlessly hold itself up. It requires deep structural foundations and constant maintenance. Sustainability is an active, load-bearing framework.
And the modern foundation for this concept was permanently solidified in 1987. The United Nations commissioned the Brundtland Report, spearheaded by Gro Harlem Brundtland, the former Prime Minister of Norway.
They had a tough job. They were tasked with reconciling the intense friction between the developing world's desperate need for economic growth to alleviate poverty and the undeniable limits of the global environment.
And the resulting report, titled Our Common Future, established the definitive standard that we still use today. They defined sustainable development as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs.
It is an incredibly elegant ethical framework. It forces a temporal shift in how we view economics.
It really does. Every time an industry extracts a resource or builds a factory, the Brundtland framework demands they ask, if our great-grandchildren attempt to execute this exact same process, will they possess the resources and a stable enough climate to survive?
And if the answer is no, the process is fundamentally unsustainable.
Exactly. But the Brundtland definition is highly conceptual. To operationalize it, economists and theorists expanded it into a framework known as the triple bottom line.
That was a phrase coined by John Elkington in the 1990s, right?
Yes. He argued that sustainability isn't just about saving trees, it is a three-legged stool. If any one leg is missing, the entire structure collapses.
Let's go through the legs. The first leg is the environmental pillar,
which is the traditional focus minimizing ecological footprint, deploying solar energy, preserving biodiversity, and respecting the planetary boundaries.
The second leg is the social pillar. This focuses on human equity. You cannot claim to have a sustainable green energy supply chain if the cobalt in the batteries is mined using child labor.
Or if the solar panels are manufactured in facilities with abusive working conditions. True sustainability requires fair wages, safe labor practices, and the uplifting of local communities.
And the third leg, which often creates the most friction, is the economic pillar. An enterprise must remain financially viable. It must survive and thrive long-term.
The revolutionary premise of the triple bottom line is that pursuing aggressive environmental and social goals does not have to be mutually exclusive with generating profit. In fact, in a world of resource scarcity and carbon taxes, green innovation becomes the ultimate competitive economic advantage.
Let's scale that up and look at the macroeconomic paradigm we currently live in. Since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, global capitalism has operated on a linear economy. It is entirely based on a take-make-dispose model.
We extract virgin raw materials from the earth. We manufacture them into a product, say a smartphone. We use that phone for an average of 24 months.
And when the battery degrades, we simply throw the entire incredibly complex piece of engineering into a landfill.
Right. It's a one-way, high-speed highway that inevitably ends at a cliff edge of resource depletion. What industrial engineers and economists are desperately trying to transition toward is a circular economy.
The circular economy. This is heavily championed by organizations like the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. It demands a total redesign of how we handle materials.
The fundamental goal is to decouple economic growth from the consumption of finite resources. It attempts to eliminate the very concept of waste by keeping products, components, and materials in continuous, high-value circulation.
It requires completely destroying the concept of planned obsolescence. In a circular economy, if your smartphone breaks, it isn't glued together. It is designed for easy disassembly and repair.
And when the technology is finally totally obsolete, the supply chain is structured to meticulously harvest every single rare earth metal, every ounce of copper, and every piece of glass to serve as the raw material for the next generation of devices.
So we are replacing the linear highway to the cliff edge with a massive, self-sustaining, closed-loop roundabout.
I love the roundabout analogy. And this isn't just an abstract academic theory. There is a massive, highly structured global framework pushing for this exact transition. In 2015, the United Nations unanimously adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs.
The SDGs are a collection of 17 interlinked global goals designed to be a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for people and the planet. They cover everything from zero hunger and gender equality to clean water.
But sitting right at the center of the framework is SDG 13, which mandates urgent climate action.
When you translate those UN goals into the cutthroat vocabulary of Wall Street and global finance, you arrive at ESG. This stands for environmental, social, and governance criteria.
Over the last decade, ESG has transformed from a niche ethical concept into a massive financial instrument.
Before massive institutional investors like pension funds or asset managers like BlackRock commit millions of dollars of capital, they increasingly demand a rigorous ESG audit.
They want to know the environmental risk. Is this company's supply chain vulnerable to sea level rise or future carbon taxes? They assess the social risk. Does this company face massive strikes due to poor labor practices?
And governance. Is the executive board transparent and free from corruption?
Exactly. ESG is not fundamentally about corporate altruism. It is about long-term risk management in a rapidly destabilizing world. Though it is worth noting that the vocabulary of ESG is currently facing intense political backlash.
Oh, definitely. There's huge debate regarding how inconsistently those ratings are actually calculated and applied.
Right, the metrics can be all over the place.
I think what's often missed here is how this macro philosophy scales down to the individual. I want you, the listener, to reflect on your own life for a moment. Look around your room. Look at your habits.
Are they linear or circular?
When you buy a coffee, when you upgrade your laptop, are you accelerating down that one-way highway, or are you part of the roundabout? Which perfectly bridges the gap to our next layer of vocabulary.
How these global frameworks manifest in your kitchen, your garage, and your rubbish bin.
Exactly. Let's dive into the daily choices. The nuance of waste, energy, and food.
Waste is undeniably the most tangible, visible environmental issue we interact with every single day. But the vocabulary we use to describe what we throw away lacks critical to nuance. Most people just use the blanket term recycling.
Right. You throw a plastic bottle into the blue bin and you feel like you've saved the planet. But recycling is a massive umbrella term that hides a lot of thermodynamic inefficiency.
True recycling means processing used materials to be utilized again in a similar capacity. Countries like Germany excel at this, managing to officially recycle or compost over 65% of their municipal waste.
But the vocabulary requires us to distinguish between upcycling and downcycling. Upcycling is a process of creative reuse that transforms waste materials or unwanted products into new materials or products of better quality and higher environmental value.
For example, taking old, discarded industrial shipping tarps and sewing them into high-end, incredibly durable messenger bags, you are extending the material's life while increasing its value.
Downcycling, on the other hand, is the dirty secret of the modern plastics industry.
It really is.
It is a recycling process where the resulting material is of significantly lower quality and functionality than the original material.
This is entirely due to polymer science. When you take a clear PET plastic water bottle, mess it down, and chop it up, the long polymer chains that give the plastic its strength begin to break and shorten.
It becomes brittle. You rarely turn an old plastic bottle into a new plastic bottle. Instead, it gets downcycled into polyester fibers for cheap fast fashion clothing or synthetic carpeting.
And once that carpet is worn out, the plastic has degraded so much that it cannot be recycled again. It goes straight to the landfill.
Downcycling is a really shocking reality check. It is like making a photocopy of a photocopy. Each time you run it through the machine, the image degrades. Eventually, it is just unrecognizable, gray static, and you throw it away.
Downcycling doesn't prevent the material from ending up in a landfill. It merely delays the inevitable by one single life cycle.
And when organic matter reaches those landfills, it creates a massive invisible problem. If you throw a banana peel into a landfill, it gets buried under tons of trash, cutting off its oxygen supply.
It undergoes anaerobic decomposition, which generates massive amounts of methane gas.
Which, as we established, is a super pollutant. That is why the zero-waste philosophy heavily emphasizes composting, allowing organic matter to break down aerobically with oxygen,
Turning it back into nutrient-rich soil instead of a dangerous greenhouse gas.
Beyond the kitchen, we have the vocabulary of the unseen technological threats. E-waste, or electronic waste, is the fastest-growing waste stream on the planet.
We discard roughly 50 million metric tons of phones, laptops, and batteries every year. Yet, formal, safe recycling facilities only process about 17% of it.
The rest is often illegally exported to the developing world, to places like Agbog Blashi in Ghana. There, informal workers use highly toxic acid baths or open-air burning to melt the plastic away and extract the tiny amounts of copper, gold, and rare earth metals inside.
It is a catastrophic health hazard. And then we have the microscopic invasion of microplastics.
These are tiny plastic fragments, generally defined as being less than 5 millimeters in length, resulting from the breakdown of larger plastic debris or the shedding of synthetic clothing in the washing machine.
They are completely pervasive. Because they are so small, they bypass water filtration systems. Scientists have documented microplastics bioaccumulating in the deepest trenches of the ocean.
Falling embedded in the snow in the pristine Arctic and recently circulating directly within the human bloodstream.
It forces a massive reckoning with how we engineer our daily lives. But let's shift gears from the materials we discard to the power we consume. The defining infrastructure challenge of our era is the energy transition.
This is the monumental, globally coordinated shift away from centralized, non-renewable, depleting fossil fuel sources toward distributed, renewable energy.
And the vocabulary here is actually incredibly optimistic right now. Renewable sources, which naturally replenish themselves on a human timescale, now account for over 30% of total global electricity production.
The economics have completely flipped. Due to economies of scale and massive manufacturing advancements, solar power is now officially the cheapest source of bulk electricity in human history.
We are seeing massive deployments of offshore wind farms, where giant turbines capture the immense uninterrupted kinetic energy of ocean winds.
We also have hydroelectric power, utilizing the flow of massive rivers through dams, which is so effective that it powers nearly the entirety of Norway's national grid.
And geothermal energy, which taps directly into the volcanic heat of the Earth's crust, is successfully heating over 90% of the homes in Iceland.
But the energy transition isn't just about generation, it's about the grid. The fatal flaw of solar and wind is intermittency. The sun sets and the wind stops blowing. To manage this, we need smart grids.
These are highly digitized, incredibly complex electrical networks that use AI and real-time data to perfectly balance electricity supply and demand.
If the wind drops off suddenly, the smart grid instantly pulls stored power from millions of grid-scale lithium-ion batteries or even from plugged-in EVs to stabilize the system.
Speaking of EVs, or electric vehicles, they are the consumer face of this transition. Over 10 million new EVs were sold globally in just 2023. We also have hybrid vehicles acting as a vital transitional bridge for consumers anxious about battery range.
But the unsung hero of this entire movement is simply energy efficiency, which sounds incredibly boring, but it's mathematically profound. Energy efficiency means performing the exact same task while drawing significantly less power.
The global transition from incandescent light bulbs to LED bulbs shaved massive amounts of gigawatts off the global demand curve. The cheapest, cleanest energy is the energy you simply don't need to generate in the first place.
Yet despite all these stunning technological advancements, the transition is fighting a massive artificial headwind: fossil fuel subsidies.
This is the most frustrating economic reality. A subsidy is financial assistance granted by a government. In 2022, the total global subsidies handed to the coal, oil, and gas industries reached a staggering $7 trillion.
$7 trillion. It is nearly impossible for clean, renewable technologies to compete fairly in a free market when the incumbent fossil fuel industry is being artificially propped up by that much public money.
That same intense friction between entrenched, subsidized systems and necessary innovation exists in our food vocabulary. The way we eat is a massive driver of the climate crisis. There is a stark contrast between factory farming and sustainable agriculture.
Factory farming, or intensive animal agriculture, relies on cramming thousands of animals into confined spaces. It requires massive amounts of fossil fuel-derived synthetic fertilizers to grow the corn and soy to feed them.
And if we look specifically at beef, ruminant animals undergo a digestive process called enteric fermentation, which causes them to burp massive volumes of methane directly into the atmosphere.
Which is why climate scientists continuously highlight the disproportionate environmental benefit of shifting toward a plant-based diet. But the vocabulary of food sustainability goes beyond just the ingredients. It involves logistics. We have to consider food miles.
Food miles represent the geographical distance your food travels from the farm where it was grown to the plate where you eat it. Buying a locally grown apple from a farmer a few towns over has a negligible transport footprint.
Buying out-of-season berries that were flown thousands of miles in a refrigerated cargo plane carries a massive hidden carbon penalty.
And then there is the ultimate systemic failure, food waste. The global statistics are genuinely hard to fathom. Roughly 1/3 of all food produced globally for human consumption is lost or wasted every single year.
1/3. Imagine walking into a grocery store, buying 3 heavy bags of groceries, walking out to the parking lot, and immediately throwing 1 full bag directly into the dumpster. That is exactly what humanity is doing on a planetary scale.
We are burning fossil fuels, clearing forests, and depleting freshwater aquifers to grow food that simply rots in a landfill and produces methane.
But the vocabulary of agricultural solutions is evolving rapidly. We are moving beyond just organic farming and adopting regenerative agriculture. This is a beautiful concept.
Regenerative agriculture doesn't just seek to do less harm, it actively seeks to heal the ecosystem. It focuses on restoring the deep microbiome of the soil.
By minimizing plowing and using cover crops, regenerative farmers actually pull carbon out of the atmosphere and lock it deep underground in the root systems. They turn the farm itself into a massive carbon sink.
And they often pair this with agroforestry, which is the intentional integration of trees and shrubs directly into crop and animal farming systems to create a more diverse, resilient microclimate.
Knowing this vocabulary transforms your perspective. Think about your next dinner table conversation. If a friend asks why you ordered the veggie burger instead of the beef, you don't just say it's better for the earth.
You now have the precise vocabulary of factory farming, methane emissions, enteric fermentation, and food miles to clearly articulate the math behind that choice.
However, we have to acknowledge a harsh reality. Individual choices like eating less meat, buying an EV, or meticulously sorting your recycling are undeniably essential for cultural momentum. But if the underlying macroeconomic and legal systems do not change, personal environmentalism feels a bit like trying to bail out the Titanic with a teaspoon.
That is the exact friction. Without aggressive, systemic, government-level intervention, personal efforts are just a drop in the ocean. To actually fix the engine, we must understand the vocabulary of the mechanics pulling the massive levers of power. Let's move to the rules of the game: international policy, finance, and the activism that forces their hand.
Navigating global climate diplomacy is essentially learning to decode an alphabet soup of acronyms. But these acronyms represent the legal architecture of our future.
The foundation of modern climate diplomacy is the Paris Agreement, adopted in 2015.
And what made the Paris Agreement a historic diplomatic breakthrough was its structure. Previous treaties, like the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, attempted a top-down approach.
Kyoto legally mandated specific emission cuts for wealthy countries, but it failed spectacularly, primarily because the United States, the largest historical emitter, refused to ratify it, arguing it unfairly exempted developing economies like China.
So the architects of the Paris Agreement flipped the model. They used a bottom-up approach. Nearly 200 countries agreed to a shared, overarching goal, holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees.
But the genius of Paris is how they plan to achieve it. Instead of forcing quotas, every single country submits an NDC, a nationally determined contribution.
An NDC is essentially a voluntary, localized business plan. Each nation looks at their own economy and says, here is exactly how much we promise to cut our emissions by 2030, and here is how we will do it.
The catch is a legal mechanism known as the ratchet. Every 5 years, countries are required to return to the negotiating table and submit an updated NDC that is significantly more ambitious than the last one.
Those massive negotiating tables are called COPs, the Conference of the Parties. These are the massive annual United Nations climate summits where tens of thousands of diplomats, scientists, and lobbyists gather.
For instance, COP26 in Glasgow produced the Glasgow Climate Pact, which for the very first time in UN history explicitly mentioned the need to phase down coal power.
Overseeing the stark scientific reality that dictates all these negotiations is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They do not conduct original research.
Instead, they are the world's leading body of scientists who painstakingly compile, review, and synthesize thousands of peer-reviewed studies to present policymakers with an undeniable, unified consensus on exactly how rapidly the climate is destabilizing.
But knowing the science is one thing. Forcing a massive capitalist economy to actually change its behavior is another. How do policymakers turn an NDC into reality? They use economic levers. And the most complex and powerful lever is a cap-and-trade system.
Cap-and-trade is a market-based approach to controlling pollution. Here's how the mechanism works mathematically. A central governing body like the European Union, which operates the world's largest emissions trading system, sets a strict, legally binding limit, or a cap, on the total amount of greenhouse gases that can be emitted by all the factories and power plants in the region.
The government then issues or auctions off millions of allowances or permits. Each permit gives a company the legal right to emit exactly 1 ton of CO2.
If a brilliant company upgrades its factory and pollutes significantly less than its cap, it suddenly has leftover surplus permits. It can then trade or sell those extra permits on the open market for a massive profit.
But if a lazy, dirty company refuses to modernize, they will blow right past their cap. To avoid massive legal fines, they are forced to go to the market and buy those extra permits from the clean company.
This means the dirty company is literally bleeding cash to the clean company. And the real kicker: every single year, the government lowers the overall cap. They pull permits out of the market.
The supply shrinks, the price of a permit skyrockets, and eventually it becomes so obscenely expensive to pollute that even the dirtiest companies are mathematically forced to invent clean technology.
It is an elegant use of free market greed to achieve environmental goals. A more direct, less complex tool is carbon pricing or carbon tax, which just slaps a flat fee on every ton emitted.
And on the purely political front, we frequently hear debates surrounding a Green New Deal. The Green New Deal is a massive proposed package of public policy and investment. It aims to solve the dual crises of climate change and economic inequality simultaneously.
It suggests mobilizing the economy on a scale not seen since World War II, pouring trillions into renewable infrastructure to create millions of high-paying, unionized green jobs.
However, where there are massive amounts of policy and profit at stake, there is an equal amount of corporate deception. You must understand the vocabulary of greenwashing.
Greenwashing is the dark art of corporate public relations. It occurs when an organization spends significantly more time and money marketing themselves as environmentally friendly than they actually spend minimizing their environmental impact. They use vague, unregulated language to mask their inaction.
You see terms like eco-friendly, all-natural, or the increasingly popular nature-based solutions. They sound wonderful, but without strict, legally binding metrics, they are essentially meaningless. Greenwashing is designed to placate an anxious consumer base while protecting the fossil fuel status quo.
This brings us to the deeply human ethical element of all these policies. We have to talk about the international friction of climate finance and climate justice.
This is the fault line that nearly fractures every single COP negotiation. The historical reality is that wealthy, industrialized nations, the global north, built their massive economic wealth by burning cheap fossil fuels for over a century and a half. They loaded the atmosphere with the carbon that is currently causing the crisis.
But the developing nations, the global south, who contributed a tiny fraction to the historical problem, are currently suffering the most catastrophic impacts. They lack the infrastructure to survive the superstorms, the droughts, and the rising seas.
Therefore, the concept of climate justice argues that those who cause the problem have a profound moral and financial obligation to assist those who are being destroyed by it.
To operationalize this, at a summit in 2009, wealthy nations pledged to provide $100 billion a year in climate finance to help developing nations build green energy grids and adapt to extreme weather.
But the execution of that pledge has been deeply flawed. Not only have wealthy nations consistently failed to hit the $100 billion target, but much of the money they do provide comes in the form of interest-bearing loans rather than direct grants.
This forces developing nations who are already dealing with climate devastation to take on crippling national debt just to survive a crisis they didn't create.
And that demand for justice applies domestically, too, through a vital concept known as a just transition. I want to spend some time on the just transition because it is the linchpin of political success.
It is incredibly easy for an environmental advocate living in a coastal city to point to a rural region like Appalachia in the U.S. or the Ruhr Valley in Germany and demand shut down the coal mines immediately for the sake of the planet.
From a purely scientific carbon budget perspective, they are right. The mines must close. But from a sociological perspective, if you just padlock the gates, you instantly destroy the entire economic foundation of those communities. You plunge tens of thousands of families into immediate poverty.
A just transition guarantees that as we inevitably dismantle the fossil fuel economy, the vulnerable workers are protected. It means the government steps in to provide full salary replacement, guaranteed pensions, and massive investments in retraining programs so a coal miner can seamlessly transition into a high-paying job maintaining offshore wind turbines.
It is the realization that you cannot build a sustainable future by treating working-class humans as stranded assets. If the Green Revolution fails socially, it will fail politically.
And that intense tension between the urgent, uncompromising physics of the climate and the sluggish, compromised reality of politics is exactly what fuels environmental activism.
The vocabulary of activism is essential. You have NGOs, non-governmental organizations like Greenpeace or the WWF, who operate outside of the government to hold power to account through research and lobbying.
You have massive global protests like the Fridays for Future movement, initiated by Greta Thunberg. And when traditional lobbying and protests are systematically ignored by the political class, you see the rise of civil disobedience.
Civil disobedience is the peaceful, public, and highly intentional breaking of the law to draw attention to a moral crisis. Groups like Extinction Rebellion use tactics like blocking major city intersections or chaining themselves to bank headquarters.
The goal isn't to be popular. The goal is to be impossible to ignore, thereby forcing a massive, uncomfortable public debate.
Another highly effective institutional activism lever is fossil fuel divestment. This is a financial boycott. Over the last decade, activists have successfully pressured universities, massive pension funds, and philanthropic institutions to pull their investments, to divest from top coal, oil, and gas companies.
Over $40 trillion in assets have been committed to divestment. The underlying theory of change is that by removing the social license to operate, you increase the cost of capital for fossil fuel firms, making it harder for them to finance new drilling projects.
And we absolutely must acknowledge the internal psychological toll all of this takes on individuals, particularly the younger generation, who feel they are inheriting a broken world. The vocabulary has expanded to include eco-anxiety.
Eco-anxiety is a chronic, overwhelming fear, grief, and worry regarding the scale of environmental destruction and the perceived political inaction. It is a very real, very heavy psychological burden that paralyzes people.
But while humanity endlessly argues in boardrooms, negotiates treaties, and wrestles with eco-anxiety, the actual physical Earth is silently, powerfully responding to the chemistry.
I want to transition us from the realm of human policy and abstract economics to the magnificent, complex, and currently fragile vocabulary of nature itself. Let's look at the canvas we operate on: ecosystems, sinks, and advanced scientific thresholds.
The foundational concept of the natural world is biodiversity. This refers to the sheer, breathtaking variety of life on Earth at all levels, from genetic diversity within a single population to the variety of entire ecosystems.
To give it scale, the Amazon rainforest alone is believed to hold roughly 10% of all known species on the entire planet.
These species do not exist in isolation. They form complex, interdependent webs called ecosystems, communities of interacting organisms and their physical environment. And it is vital to understand that biodiversity isn't just about preserving a pretty landscape. It is the fundamental infrastructure that keeps the planet habitable.
Exactly. Coastal wetlands, for instance, are entire ecosystems that act as massive natural sponges. They filter pollutants out of the water and absorb the devastating impact of storm surges and floods.
But globally, ecosystems are facing catastrophic habitat destruction. Human urban expansion, industrial agriculture, and logging are physically bulldozing these habitats.
Which is the primary mechanism driving what biologists call the sixth mass extinction. We are losing species at an unprecedented, terrifying rate The concept of the rivet popper hypothesis is useful here.
If you are flying in an airplane and a few rivets pop out of the wing, the plane still flies. But if you keep losing rivets, eventually you lose the one critical rivet that causes the entire wing to snap off.
That is how ecosystems collapse. We have a growing list of endangered species that are at the absolute brink of vanishing forever. The Amur leopard is a tragic example. There are estimated to be fewer than 100 left in the wild.
Conversely, the globalization of human trade has introduced invasive species.
Invasive species are non-native plants, animals, or pathogens that are introduced to a new environment, often inadvertently in the ballast water of massive cargo ships. Because they did not evolve in that specific ecosystem, they have no natural predators.
They spread aggressively, outcompeting and decimating the native wildlife. The cane toads in Australia or the zebra mussels in the Great Lakes are textbook examples of invasive species wreaking havoc.
But there is a thrilling vocabulary of hope in biology, too. Rewilding. I think this is one of the most exciting concepts in environmental science.
It is a radical shift in conservation strategy. Traditional conservation was about building a fence around a degraded area and trying to manage its decline. Rewilding is the active restoration of ecosystems by reintroducing native keystone species that had been wiped out by humans and then stepping back and letting nature manage itself.
The classic example is the reintroduction of gray wolves to Yellowstone National Park in the 1990s. When the wolves returned, they triggered what is called a trophic cascade.
They hunted the overpopulated elk, which meant the elk stopped overgrazing the riverbanks. The willow trees grew back. The trees brought back songbirds and beavers. The beavers built dams, which created wetlands, which brought back amphibians and fish.
Reintroducing one predator literally changed the physical geography of the rivers. It is nature healing nature.
When it comes to managing the planet's forests, the vocabulary requires extreme precision. We know deforestation is the permanent destruction of forests to make land available for other uses, like cattle ranching. But the solutions are often conflated. We have reforestation and afforestation.
Reforestation is replanting trees in an area where a forest historically existed but was recently cut down. Afforestation is planting trees in an area where there was historically no forest cover at all.
And the critical nuance here is that you cannot just plant a million fast-growing pine trees in perfectly straight lines and claim you have recreated a forest. A brand new commercial timber plantation of a single tree species is basically a green desert.
It cannot instantly replace the complex, rich biodiversity and fungal networks of an old-growth forest that took millennia to develop.
However, planting the right trees in the right places is vital for creating carbon sinks. A carbon sink is any natural reservoir, like a deep forest, the ocean, or peatland bogs, that absorbs more carbon dioxide than it releases.
They execute this through the process of carbon sequestration, physically pulling carbon from the air via photosynthesis and locking it into biomass and soil. Peatlands, for instance, cover only 3% of the global land surface, but they store nearly 30% of all the world's soil carbon.
But it is a terrifyingly delicate balance. If a dense forest is a massive carbon sink and an extreme drought hits, followed by a lightning strike that triggers a massive megafire, that forest instantly flips. It becomes a massive carbon source, vomiting decades of stored CO2 right back into the atmosphere in a matter of days.
We see similar delicate balances shattering in marine ecosystems. We mentioned ocean acidification, but we also have coral bleaching. This is a heartbreaking physiological reaction. Corals have a symbiotic relationship with tiny, colorful algae called zooxanthellae that live inside their tissues and provide them with food through photosynthesis.
But when the ocean water gets anomalously warm due to climate change, the coral gets severely stressed. It physically expels the algae. The coral turns stark, ghostly white. It bleaches. It isn't dead yet, but it is effectively starving. If the water doesn't cool down quickly, the entire reef dies.
Add to that the sheer volume of plastic pollution. There are an estimated 170 trillion microscopic pieces of plastic floating in our oceans. And then there are marine dead zones. These are vast areas in oceans or lakes where dissolved oxygen levels plummet so low that marine life suffocates.
The massive dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico is caused by nitrogen fertilizer runoff flowing down the Mississippi River, triggering massive algae blooms that suck all the oxygen out of the water when they decompose.
To understand how all these interconnected natural systems react to relentless human pressure, we must look at advanced scientific thresholds. The most critical, absolutely vital term to understand here is a tipping point.
A tipping point is a critical threshold within the global climate system. Once that threshold is crossed, it triggers a massive, sudden, and entirely irreversible shift in the state of the system, even if human emissions are immediately reduced to zero.
Let me use an analogy for this. It is like pushing a heavy boulder up a steep hill. It is incredibly hard work, and the boulder resists. But if you stop pushing, the boulder just sits there, or maybe rolls back a foot. You are still in control.
But once you push that boulder over the very peak of the hill, that is the tipping point. Gravity completely takes over. You can let go, you can try to pull it back, but it doesn't matter. The boulder is crashing to the bottom, and the system is out of your control.
That crashing boulder is what scientists call a positive feedback loop, a process where the output of a system amplifies the system, causing an accelerating cycle. We touched on this with permafrost warming causes thawing, thawing releases methane, methane causes more warming.
Another terrifying feedback loop involves the Arctic sea ice, and this brings in the crucial concept of albedo. Albedo is a measure of the reflectivity of a surface. To make the physics of albedo unforgettable, imagine you are walking outside in the middle of July on a scorching summer day.
If you're wearing a pure white t-shirt, you feel relatively cool. The white fabric reflects the majority of the sun's shortwave radiation away from your body. That is high albedo.
The Arctic ice caps are effectively the Earth's white t-shirt. They reflect massive amounts of solar radiation back into space, keeping the polar regions cold.
But as the planet warms, that white ice melts, exposing the dark, deep ocean water underneath. And dark water has an incredibly low albedo. It acts like a black t-shirt. It aggressively absorbs the sun's heat instead of reflecting it.
So the Earth is effectively taking off its white t-shirt and putting on a black t-shirt in the middle of a heat wave. The dark ocean absorbs massive amounts of heat, which dramatically warms the water, which melts even more of the surrounding ice, exposing even more dark water.
That is a deadly, self-reinforcing feedback loop driven entirely by a change in albedo. And if we cross the tipping point where the Arctic becomes completely ice-free in the summer, we fundamentally alter the planetary weather systems.
And all of this is anthropogenic, a scientific term you will see constantly in journals. It derives from the Greek word anthropos, meaning human. It means environmental pollution and pollutants originating from human activity.
Faced with these anthropogenic crises, our overarching policy responses fall into two distinct categories: mitigation and adaptation.
Mitigation is playing offense. It is addressing the root cause. It involves actions designed to reduce or prevent the emission of greenhouse gases, transitioning to wind energy, passing a carbon tax, or halting deforestation. These are mitigation strategies.
Adaptation, on the other hand, is playing defense. It is acknowledging the harsh reality that a certain amount of severe climate change is already locked into the system, and we need to engineer ways to survive it.
Adaptation is building massive, multi-billion-dollar seawalls around coastal cities like Jakarta. It is genetically engineering drought-resistant strains of wheat for farmers in sub-Saharan Africa.
To guide our remaining mitigation efforts, scientists calculate the carbon budget. This is a strict mathematical maximum. It is the absolute total amount of CO2 that humanity can still emit into the atmosphere while holding a 50% chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
It is a finite pie. And at our current global emission rate of roughly 40 billion tons a year, we will burn through the entire remaining budget within a decade.
Which creates a massive, looming economic crisis regarding stranded assets. Fossil fuel companies currently have trillions of dollars worth of unextracted oil, coal, and gas reserves, counted as massive wealth on their corporate balance sheets.
But if international law dictates we must adhere to our carbon budget to survive, we legally cannot afford to burn those reserves. Suddenly, those reserves are essentially worthless. They become stranded assets, which could trigger a massive shock in the global financial markets.
And for the vulnerable communities where mitigation failed and adaptation is physically or financially impossible, the international community must finally confront the vocabulary of loss and damage.
This refers to the irreversible, devastating harms that go beyond what people can adapt to, like a small Pacific island nation being permanently swallowed by the rising sea, erasing a culture and a sovereign territory forever.
After decades of wealthy nations blocking it due to fears of endless legal liability, a historic loss and damage fund was finally agreed upon at COP27 to provide financial solidarity to these devastated nations.
Having covered the deep atmospheric science, the complex policy levers, and the sprawling natural canvas, we must shift to the final, crucial layer of mastering this language. segmenting out the nuance.
This is about the subtle differences, the confusing pairings, and the rich idioms that native English speakers use in high-level boardrooms to argue, persuade, and navigate the reality of the crisis.
Precision in language is critical because many environmental terms sound incredibly similar, but possess entirely different legal and practical meanings. Let's start with a classic corporate trap: emission versus omission.
An emission, spelled with an E, is the physical release of a greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. An omission, spelled with an O, is the act of leaving something out or failing to do something. The nuance here becomes critical when reading corporate sustainability reports.
Let me give you a real-world boardroom example. A company produces a glossy report detailing how they cut their Scope 1 emissions, the direct emissions from their own factories, but they completely ignore their Scope 3 emissions, which are the massive emissions generated by their supply chain and the consumers actually using their products.
By leaving out Scope 3, that omission of data deliberately hides the true scale of their emissions. It's a linguistic sleight of hand. Then we have a classic philosophical divide within the environmental movement itself: conservation versus preservation.
These are often used interchangeably, but historically they represent two completely different approaches to nature. Conservation is an ethos of sustainable use. It is about actively managing and protecting natural resources so they can yield the greatest benefit to humans over the longest period of time. Sustainable forestry management or regulated hunting quotas fall under conservation.
Preservation, however, is about strict protection from human interference. It is the belief that nature has intrinsic value, completely independent of its utility to humans. It is drawing a hard line around a pristine wilderness area and saying, no logging, no mining, no human development allowed.
What about the distinction between ecology and the environment?
The environment is the broad, encompassing term for the natural world and physical surroundings we live in. Ecology is a highly specific scientific discipline. It is a branch of biology that rigorously studies the complex interactions between organisms and their environment. Ecology is the mathematical and observational science of the connections.
Here is a trio that trips everyone up in the consumer space. You see these slapped on packaging all the time: renewable, recyclable, and sustainable. Consumers treat them as identical badges of green virtue, but they are absolutely not synonyms.
That is a crucial distinction. Let's break it down using life cycle assessment logic. Renewable simply refers to the source of the material or energy. Solar energy is renewable because the sun won't run out. Recycle is a technical capability. A plastic bottle is recyclable because the physical polymer can, theoretically, be melted down.
But just because a product is made from a renewable resource or is technically recyclable does not automatically make it sustainable. For example, cutting down a massive, ancient, old-growth forest in Canada, processing the trees into wood pellets and shipping them across the ocean to burn in a UK power plant is technically a renewable energy source because trees grow back.
But the immediate destruction of biodiversity and the massive pulse of carbon emitted makes it completely unsustainable from a climate perspective.
Achieving real fluency in English environmental discourse is also about knowing which words naturally pair up. Linguists call these collocations. You don't just do climate change or fix the climate.
Right. You tackle or address climate change. Because it isn't a simple math equation with a final answer. It is a chronic, systemic condition that must be managed. You achieve net zero. You phase out fossil fuels. You combat deforestation. You invest in renewables.
Memorizing these specific verb-noun pairings provides linguistic muscle memory. It makes you sound instantly authoritative and deeply embedded in the subject matter.
And because environmental discussions are fundamentally debates about economics, human rights, and the future of society, you need the language to navigate deep disagreement politely but firmly. In a boardroom, you can't just shout someone down.
If an executive makes a claim you doubt regarding an offset project, you might pivot the conversation by saying, "I see your point, but the reality of the carbon accounting is more nuanced," or that is one perspective, though climate scientists would argue.
Alternatively, when agreeing with strong, undeniable data, you solidify the consensus by saying, "That's a compelling point. The IPCC science is quite clear on this."
Let's bring it home with the most colorful, persuasive part of the English language: idioms. These are figurative phrases that paint a vivid, immediate picture in the listener's mind. In high-stakes environmental debates, they are deployed constantly as strategic tools. Take the classic: the elephant in the room.
This refers to an obvious massive problem that everyone in the room is acutely aware of, but nobody wants to discuss because it is socially uncomfortable or politically dangerous. For example, in a heated political debate about funding new solar arrays, a frustrated scientist might finally interject, "This tech is great, but the elephant in the room is global meat consumption. We cannot hit our targets if we ignore the agricultural sector."
Or the tip of the iceberg. This implies that the problem you can see is just a tiny fraction of a much larger hidden crisis. The plastic shopping bags washed up on the beach are disturbing, but they are just the tip of the iceberg. The real existential crisis is the millions of tons of invisible microplastics suspended in the deep water column below.
A drop in the ocean is used to describe a tiny, almost insignificant action relative to the massive systemic scale of what is required. A corporation switching to paper straws is great for PR, but compared to their industrial coal emissions, it's a drop in the ocean.
Then there is the absolute favorite of political analysts: kick the can down the road. This means cowardly delaying difficult, necessary actions and intentionally passing the catastrophic consequences to future generations. Governments have been kicking the climate policy can down the road since the 1990s, and as the tipping points approach, we have simply run out of road.
But we also have idioms of immense action and hope, like turn the tide. This means to decisively reverse a negative trend. If we fully fund international rewilding projects and enforce a global carbon tax, we might just turn the tide on the sixth mass extinction.
And a critical, slightly cynical idiom to watch out for in corporate PR and government pledges: moving goalposts. In a sport like football, if you secretly move the goalposts closer, it is suddenly much easier to score a goal.
In climate policy, if a government realizes it is going to completely fail to hit its legally binding 2030 emissions reduction target, and instead of passing stricter laws and working harder, they simply rewrite the legislation to make the target 2040. They are moving the goalposts. They're changing the rules to avoid admitting failure.
Idioms are essentially the secret handshake of ultimate fluency. When you use a phrase like moving the goalposts in a tense boardroom discussion about a flawed ESG report, you don't just demonstrate that you know English vocabulary. You prove that you deeply, strategically understand the political maneuvering behind the policy. You establish yourself as a formidable voice in the room.
I challenge you, the listener, to start incorporating this vocabulary into your daily life. But the next time you read a news article about a COP summit or a corporate sustainability pledge, look for the collocations, look for the idioms.
Actively watch how CEOs and politicians attempt to dodge the elephant in the room, and use your understanding of Scope 3 emissions and additionality to see right through the greenwashing.
Because ultimately, this brings us to a profound underlying philosophical reflection, often tied to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Language does far more than just passively describe our reality. Language actually shapes and creates our reality. If we do not possess the precise vocabulary to identify a systemic problem, if you do not know the exact word for downcycling, or you cannot explain the terrifying physics of an albedo feedback loop, you are effectively powerless to fight against it.
The crisis remains an invisible, overwhelming anxiety. You cannot fix the engine of the planet if you don't know the names of the parts, and more importantly, how those parts interact.
But by mastering these words, by understanding the profound difference between weather and climate, or between carbon neutral and net zero, you are doing far more than just improving your English proficiency. You are claiming your rightful seat at the table of humanity's survival.
The environmental crisis is the defining challenge of our century, and it affects every single one of us. That means the conversation belongs to every single one of us. But knowledge only transforms into impactful action when it can be articulated clearly, persuasively, and confidently. Think back to our opening framing. We talked about how diagnosing the health of the planet isn't as clean or binary as plugging a computer into a car or looking at an X-ray of a broken bone.
The planetary diagnostic landscape is vast, murky, complicated, and filled with corporate noise and political friction. But the vocabulary we've explored in depth today, from the albedo effect and the circular economy to carbon budgets and the moral necessity of a just transition, these words are your high-resolution diagnostic tools.
They cut right through the muddy waters. They allow you to look at a complex global supply chain, point directly at the systemic fracture and say, there is the omission, there is the greenwashing. Now here is the mechanism we use to fix it.
Start with one new concept today. Bring the concept of a circular economy into a sentence. Bring the phrase tipping point into your next conversation. That is how we build the linguistic bridge to a sustainable future.
Thank you so much for joining us on this immense, vital journey through the language of our planet. As always, please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this YouTube channel so we can keep expanding our understanding of the complex world around us, one deep dive at a time. What part of your own footprint or your company's footprint are you going to examine first? And I leave you with this final thought. If language truly shapes our reality, what new words do we need to invent right now to describe the solutions we haven't even discovered yet? Until next time.